Okay. And we're going to jump in. So, the title of this workshop today is Storytelling Your Future, the Importance of Narrative to Postgraduate Success. Now, all of you, for the most part, are coming from the Rhodes and Marshall listserv, I believe. So, we're going to focus primarily on the importance of storytelling to a successful Rhodes and Marshall application. So, the outline of the presentation is as follows. We're going to talk a little bit about the importance of stories to these scholarships. I think that telling a compelling story is more important to a fellowship application than it is to, for instance, a law school application or a job application. And so I think getting into a successful fellowship applicant mindset requires a little bit of a shift in your thinking about the importance of stories. I'll talk through what I think is the basic syntax of a successful fellowship application, a successful fellowship story, and then I'll highlight some things that can strengthen those stories that you definitely want to focus on. Colleen will talk us through some examples from past applications that have been successful, giving us a kind of outline of what a successful story looks like. And then I'll talk a little bit about the sort of common pitfalls about in this kind of storytelling. It's hard to get it right and it's very easy to go astray. And so hopefully by detailing some of the common failure modes, we can save you guys from going too far off the beaten path. And we'll close out with some ideas to get you started because hopefully this whole presentation is driving towards getting your own ideation about your story on developing. So I'll turn it over to my colleague Colleen to talk a little bit about the importance of storytelling in the Rhodes and Marshall scholarship applications.
Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah. So, hi everyone. I'm Colleen. I use she, her pronouns. You joined us on Wednesday. You had a chance to kind of maybe sort of briefly hear from the two of us. And one of the things that we collectively, right, Jonathan, Lauren, and I were discussing during the information session, right, is the not just the sort of what you're sharing, but how you're sharing it, right? Anyone can kind of write sort of narrative version of their resume into a into an application process, but that is not going to help you in the long run, right? They can see the information, especially for these particular scholarships, the very basic details of where previous experiences of research or internships, and like your responsibilities through those, either through your transcripts and your resume and things like that. But just kind of providing a sort of list, essentially like a listicle essentially of these experiences that you've had, it's not particularly compelling, right? It's not interesting, it's not compelling, it's not it'll it's sharing the information at the lowest sort of levels. Storytelling is very important in all of these fellowship processes, but in particular with Rhodes and Marshall, because it is not only a compelling sort of version of your own experiences that you're sharing with those folks, but you're giving them even more context, through the narratives that you're creating, and you're building the connections for these committees through all of the experiences that you are having. So both from the perspective of how engaging are you being, right, to ensure that the folks who are reading your materials, who um, not only are excited about you as a potential candidate and want, like, kind of gives them the feeling of wanting more and wanting to meet you, absolutely. But it's also sharing and giving, allowing you to give those individuals a more holistic perspective on you as a candidate, right? And so, what, like, step one, right, just getting them interested in who you are. And so you're still sharing all of the same information, but you're doing that in a way, that allows you to to really, capture their attention, capture their imagination almost, right? And giving them that feeling of like, okay, this student has like done all of these amazing things, and you can see all of the connections from point A to point X, point Z, like all of the things from from beginning to end, soup to nuts, but also, right, maybe you're not like in the number of pages in that you have in these applications, the limit that you have, you're not able to convey the entire story, right? And so this is a great way to get those committees wanting more, right? Um, and so, as Jonathan kind of notes here in sort of the last bullet, all of those things, right? The internships that you've had and the volunteer work that you've done and the classes that you've taken, all of that's the setting, right? Those are all of the settings of the experiences that you've had. The overarching story of you as a candidate is what you are giving to them in that final product. And that's the most important thing. That is the key thing that you are trying to share with these committees at the end of the day, which is why storytelling and is so important in this process.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, Colleen. Everybody who's coming to this process is going to have everything going for them in terms of grades, in terms of resume stuff, right? In terms of the experiences that they've had, right? And so everything else equal, the story is what's going to win the day. You're selling yourself as a story to these people. And that's different, right? From just submitting an LSAT score and, a GPA and getting into law school, right? And when we think about successful storytelling at the fellowship level, it's everything that Colleen is saying, right? It's bringing your whole self to bear on these applications. American college applications bills themselves as being holistic, and to some extent that's true, but that's especially true, right, for fellowships. Everything that's true of the holistic application process for US higher education is 10 times true for fellowships, right? What these fellowships traffic on primarily is your compelling story. And so thinking about how to frame your life that you've just lived, right, in a way that's going to be engaging to a panel of 8 strangers is, for me, the key skill of turning a successful sort of set of ingredients for a fellowship application into the finished stew of the successful application itself. Now, I think that one way to operationalize this is to break down the basic syntax of a fellowship story, right? So I think all fellowship stories, and I only realized in retrospect that this spells out beef. This was not me. This was not, I did not, I'm like a vegan. This is not what I was going for. But in any case, I think the basic shape of a successful fellowship story is this. You start out with your background, right? There's some sort of origin story that began your interests, right? Maybe you had a brother that struggled with reading and that got you interested in literacy and early childhood education, right? Maybe you had a parent who got cancer when you were a child, and then that got you interested in sort of oncology and studying cancer. Maybe you come from a background where you are a Russian American immigrant, and as a result, you've had to reconcile those two cultures. And now in your career, you want to do that at the diplomatic level, right? We always try and identify something deep in your past that is the beginning of your interests, right? And that interest will lead you to step 2, right? Developing experiences. This is where the things on your resume come in. But as Colleen noted, what we're never doing, right, with a fellowship story, whether it's in a personal statement, whether it's in an interview, right, whether it's in the video introductions that you'll have to complete for our internal application, is just doing narrative resume, right? Every resume item that you adduce in a personal statement, video introduction, interview answer, right, needs to be connected to this story structure, right? I had this background that led me to be interested in this experience, right? Because my brother had a learning disability, I became interested in reading and I started tutoring for DC Reads, right? You want to draw that causal connection there. You're not simply credentialing yourself, you're telling a story about what it is that you've done. And you have a number of these experiences. You took this course with this professor, right? You took this internship with this senator, okay? And all of this should lead up to some sort of epiphany, right? About the nature of the issue that you want to address, okay? So I was interested in literacy from an early age because my brother had a learning disability. I tutored with DC Reads. I I worked with the SFS Dean's Council, right, to make education on the Hilltop more accessible. I've taken courses in education policy and equity, and now I realize that the real place within education policy where there's a lot of opportunity for change is at the ends, right? So I think we can do more for people who are just going into kindergarten, who are in preschool. We can extend services for those people, and we can do more for people who are at the end of their time at secondary education, right? Right now, there's no sort of guaranteed post-secondary education. I think we should offer something that supports people after they graduate high school, right? That is where I see there's opportunity for change in my field, right? And my background and my experiences have led me to this epiphany, this novel way of conceptualizing the field, my new problem that has not yet been sufficiently worked on, or a new solution to an existing problem, right? And that epiphany is the centerpiece of the fellowship application, okay? Now, from there, this is where the fellowship comes in. This is where the scholarship comes in, okay? Because I've had this epiphany, in order to be the kind of person who makes change with respect to this issue area, with respect to this problem in my field, I need to go to the UK in this case, right? And study with such and such a person at such and such a program. That will enable me to be the kind of change maker who can address the thing that I realized was a problem in my epiphany that I was able to have because of my experiences and because of my background. All of these things work together to make a compelling fellowship story that makes your application about something more than just, well, I want to do more school. I want to go to the United Kingdom. The roads in Marshall are super prestigious, right? This is the shape of what a successful application looks like. It has a sense of integrity, it has a sense of confluence, and it has a sense of bringing together the disparate aspects of your life into a single narrative that leads to a fellowship. Now, there's a couple key features of these stories that I think make them successful, right? So the first of these is specificity. Is your story sufficiently specific? Now, I see this a lot where people are interested in a lot of things and really big things, right? Maybe I'm interested in sort of addressing the climate crisis, okay? That's something that is super important that we need to have a lot of people working on, right? And so I'm talking generally about, okay, well, I'm going to fix climate change or something, right? Or maybe I'm interested in migrant justice. And I'm interested in making sure that all refugees who come to the US have an easy asylum process, okay? Asylum processes can be, arcane, complicated. Some people can't get through them, okay? I'm going to try and address that. All right. Another one I frequently see is I'm interested in global or planetary health, right? And accessibility of healthcare resources in the global south, say. Okay. I want to improve accessibility of healthcare resources in the global south. Okay. All of those problems are enormously important, right? But all of those problems are totally too broad. You are not going to make any sort of progress on any of those things. And also, you have done nothing in your problem identification to mark you out as somebody who has thought deeply enough about the problems in the field to identify specific problems. And you have not done anything to mark yourself out from anybody else who's working on that field. If all you can talk about is the field generally, then you've, I think, failed to sufficiently distinguish yourself from the rest of the application pool. So specificity is going to be really important here. Related to specificity, right, is tractability, okay? We need to have a problem, an issue area that something can actually be done about, right? You could be really interested in sort of the increasing frequency of solar flares in the sun and the possibility that they'll take out the electronics across, the world or something, right? But there's nothing that can really be done about that. There's nothing that you can do, and so the problem just seems too big for you, even if it's a specific problem, right? And it also makes you seem naive, right? I think when you're selling fellowships on your issue area pitch, they want to believe that you're a change maker with big ideas, right? But in order to be a change maker at all, you have to identify changes that you can actually make, right? And that's where specificity and tractability come in. On the other side of that, though, is impact, right? I think some people who zero in on specificity and tractability lose sight of impact, right? So I'm really interested in sort of, Etruscan philately. I'm really interested in coins from the predecessor state of Rome in Italy. Okay. I'm super interested. They are super significant in the history of coins and they are really significant if you're studying, numismatics or whatever. Okay. Well, um that's great, but there will always also be the question of who cares, right? You have to have something that's within your issue area that's specific, right? That an expert in your field would identify as a real problem. But the issue with a lot of things that experts identify as real problems is that their impact will not be legible to a population of lay people. And it's to a population of lay people that you're applying in these fellowships, right? You are reaching out to people who might have some field knowledge and who are generally sort of, intelligent, knowledgeable, worldly, but they're not going to understand the sort of internal viscera of your field well enough to pinpoint a problem that is too sort of like, I guess, too specific or arcane. So I think finding a good issue area, which will be the centerpiece of your fellowship story, is always going to be a balance between specificity, tractability, and impact. You want to have something that is both specific and tractable, but whose impact is outsized. And then finally, I think the last thing that you want to do in identifying an issue area that is a centerpiece of your successful story, right, is finding something that is original, right, which might mean neglected. Okay, a lot of people have identified, for instance, carbon emissions, CO2 emissions as an important feature of climate change, right? But maybe you want to look at methane emissions instead. Maybe you want to look at sulfur emissions from global shipping, which can have a sort of like depressive effect on global temperatures, right? Maybe you want to look at the really sort of ambiguous effects on the climate that aerosols have. They either have a massively sort of warming effect or a massively cooling effect, and it's unresolved. Okay. That would just be one way to take sort of, I'm interested in, climate change and breaking it down into something that's more neglected. Originality is connected to specificity and tractability, right? But it is distinct from them as well. What's a problem in your issue area that is a real problem, but that people aren't talking about enough, right? That is in some way fresh, that they're not going to have seen before. I think that is important because so many Georgetown applicants and then so many applicants nationally focus in on a small set of key issues that are compelling for a reason, right? But because there's so many people who are working on them, we run into situations frequently with applicants where you are covering ground that many other people are already covering, right? And the way to not do that is to find something that's neglected, that's original, that's specific, that's tractable, that nonetheless still will have an outside impact. So I would say, as you're designing your stories, is there any way that I can ratchet up the specificity? Is there any way I can ratchet up the tractability, ratchet up the impact, ratchet up the originality? And the best stories will do all of these things. This one's not a fun acronym, sorry, STIO. Great. So, what we're going to talk about here, I have some up on this slide, but Colleen and I have both seen like a number of sort of successful stories come together. So I think both of us are just going to kind of like talk through now like the general architecture of some successful stories. Do you have one that comes to mind, Colleen?
Yeah, sure. So, one of our students in recent years, I think Jonathan kind of that sorry. One story that comes to mind in recent years, like we have had a lot of students. I always tend to like sort of veer towards education as like my go-to examples because that is my interest area, right? And we in the past few years we have had students whose just an education policy has come up through, as Jonathan has already shared, like own like their own experiences, right? I think personal experiences are one of those things that is one of the easiest examples of a way that someone has really gained a lot of interest and sort of traction in their issue area. We've had a student in the past, you see experiences with like younger siblings or family members or friends who have had you know um educational differences, and need very specific resources, and sort of through their own families navigating those resources, or navigating those navigating those sort of spaces of accessing those resources, and coming to find that either those resources weren't accessible to them, or were accessible to them but only through very specific ways, that as that student got older, they realized, okay, we were very privileged in having the access to these resources because of where we lived, or because of the school system that we were in, or because of a family connection to something. And because of that, realizing, okay, we had this opportunity, we had this structure that was available to us, but as they got older, and started to examine education systems, within the United States, realized that we were a rarity, right? Or we were one of the only groups of people, or like one of the sort of very privileged groups of people that had the ability to access these resources. And so now they're moving into education, as education policy as a option, or as sort of their issue area. Other folks speak to watching, or again, we've had like other students in the past speaking to their experiences, like watching their parents who themselves who were educators, and seeing the sort of changes through time, across their parents' career, or family members' careers, of the resources that, again, that were available to teachers and educators, in various school districts, and how those them have dwindled over the years. Watching their parents, like, take on multiple jobs over the summer in order to fund, you know, um, in order to pay for supplies in their classrooms, and access to better textbooks, or access to better to other educational resources. And so, again, wanting to kind of go into education policy for those reasons. Other folks, they either they or their own experiences, or seeing the larger impacts on, again, friends or family, through experiences within the medical system, attempting to access medical care. I think, and those are all very important, sort of factors. But at the same time, you don't have to have like very personal experiences with your interests. Maybe for some of you, and for again, for some of our students as well, they realized that this was something that they were really dedicated to once they got to university, once they came to Georgetown, because they had the opportunity to learn more about that particular topic. Or at least dive even deeper into it. And so I think, not wanting to share like specific details about specific students, and just kind of being mindful of that. But, I think one of the things that can be really compelling for folks is, like, even if they don't have a deep personal connection to that issue, sharing, those experiences that really changed their perspective on the issue. So, even if, I think, one of the sort of the first bulleted example here is like fighting new financial crimes, right? Even I think all of you, right, are folks who were born around the time of the 2008 financial crisis, right? Probably just a little bit before, right? And while you were not there to kind of experience the really deep financial losses, and thus the anxiety of that experience for either your parents or like other family members. That is something that had a hugely detrimental impact on a lot of people, that I did experience, that I did live through. And that is something that had really wide, scale impacts on the financial, on finance generally, as like a as an industry, but especially on the ways that we look at finance, as as an industry, and on oversight of the financial industry. And so, like, I think that's something too, that even if someone did not have a deeply personal experience, like they understand through the work that they have done the wide ranging implications of that work and how important that is to people, right? So even if you can't speak to a very deeply personal connection, you can talk about and should be talking about the wider impacts of the work that you're doing or hoping to do, and how fellowships like these can impact and influence your ability to do that work. Um, yeah, Jonathan.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great example, right? So yes, when we're talking about origin, we can talk about sort of personal origin. We've talked generally about some students who, yeah, maybe have personal experience with something that's brought their attention to a particular area. But I think if you don't have personal experience with your issue area, what Colleen says is totally right. You can look to something that's historically going on. Yeah, maybe I came of age during the financial crisis and that drew my attention to new financial crimes, right? Maybe, another example, I was born during the genetic revolution. There was
Yeah,
all
yeah.
this
Mhm,
cool new technology that was coming out, right?
mhm,
We were sequencing the human genome for the first time.
mhm,
And the first time, the full impact of genetics and stuff like epigenetics was becoming legible, right? Coming of age, coming to the age of reason and coming to an awareness of the world when this stuff was going on, instilled in me as a child a deep and what has
mhm,
proven to be an abiding interest in the possibilities of genetic technologies. Then that brought me to at college, want to study, say, biology or genetics. I wanted to work in a genetics lab. I wanted to work with people who were doing this exciting work. And what I realized, after studying genetics and working in a couple genetics labs was that new genetic technology that permits genes to propagate throughout an entire population, what is called gene drives, is the most exciting sort of application of genetic technology, right? The most exciting fruit of that genetic revolution that I witnessed as a kid. And when I learned about gene drives, I had an epiphany. I knew that this was what I needed to focus on. This was the most valuable place that I could direct my attentions and direct my career, right? And then I go on from there. Alternatively, it could be something like, hey, I had no direct experience with this, but I know some people in my family had, because of the place that they grew up, real sort of similar health effects going on. And I noticed that and I figured out that that was weird. And that got me interested in sort of like the environmental impacts on population health. And that from there, I got interested in sort of global health generally and sort of health disparities in different regions. I came to Georgetown, maybe I go to the NHS and I study global health, but
mhm,
I realized I needed more interdisciplinary perspective on this. And then I transfer, say, to the college. And that's my epiphany moment, right? Interdisciplinary approaches to environmental health and global health. And then I have the future vision of going to the UK, studying in a place that has a comprehensive, healthcare system, right? And that also has major health disparities in order to look at one compelling case study for how these issues can be addressed. And then after that, I want to return to the US. So I think the basic syntax structure that we've laid out is enormously sort of flexible, right? You can fold in any number of different experiences in order to make a story that sounds, plausible, that sounds compelling. It's something that once you get the knack of will be very easy to do, right? The actual generation of the stories, will start to come naturally. And then the challenge will be finding the one that is most compelling and is most natural for you. Um, Now I'm going to talk a little bit about common failure modes of this kind of storytelling, right? So I think there's several, and I think most of them take the form of some kind of vicious excess, right? So I was talking about, oh, specificity is really important. I think some people take that too far, right? As I kind of alluded to before, you can get way too specific. You can get super, super in the weeds, and it's just not going to be relevant anymore. And that can be true of an issue area, like I was talking about, but it can also be true of sort of like any number of different things. Like, I think if you have your heart set on saying that, oh, I'm only interested in autoimmune diseases because, my mom had, Graves' disease that was undiagnosed, and, she grew to be, 50 years old before it was diagnosed, and then it caused her to have congestive heart failure. And that's something that she's still dealing with to this day. And now I'm only interested in sort of like thyroid diseases. That's a story maybe I could tell about my life. That's true of my mom, but it would be too specific, right? And I see so frequently, right, students where we're like, get specific, get specific, get specific. And you guys are all super high achieving students. You're really good at actually doing what we're saying, and then you go way too far. So I think over specifying is also a risk, right? People will be like, okay, they said CRF said specialized, right? So I'm interested in like, sort of financial regulations in like the, 14th, District of Prague. It's like, okay, that doesn't matter, right? Like there is a possibility of over specifying. Under specification, I talked a little bit about more earlier. I think that's the more common failure mode, right? People just don't specify enough. They don't delimit their issue area to something specific within their field. They don't have specific stories that motivate each section of their like larger story architecture, right? They're just like, oh, well, my family is from, Scotland, so I want to go back to the UK, right? Like their origin story is vague. The experiences that they've had are too thin on the ground. Their epiphany moment is unconvincing and vague, and the lock into the UK is vague. That would be an underspecified story, and that's a pretty common failure mode. I also think another common failure mode, right, is sort of too loose narrative control. What I mean by that, I guess, is like sometimes people really sort of stretch like the causal relationships here. They'll be like, oh, well, I interned on the hill, so I'm really interested in like the importance of sort of like, hilltop sedimentation or something, right? Like they'll try and sort of over justify the like connections between things, and they'll like try to wrap up everything that they've done into one kind of single story. The Rhodes and Marshall understand that you are people who contain multitudes, right? It's okay to have multiple interests. It's okay to have an internship that's entirely out of your field. It's okay to have had an A minus somewhere in your transcript, right? I think sometimes people try to, tie in too many sort of loose, disparate threads together to make a convincing narrative, but I think that is largely unnecessary, right? You just have to have a couple of key things that fit together to tell a story, and then the rest of the stuff that's going on in your life you don't have to worry about, or you can bring it up honestly, like, oh yeah, I mean, yes, I'm primarily interested in becoming an expert on, sort of like SEC regulations or something, but that's not the entirety of my interest. I also like drumming, like that's fine. That's fine. Not everything has to come in together to make this synthetic point. Now, the last kind of failure mode that I'll touch on is sort of the curse of knowledge. What do I mean by that? Has anybody heard that term before? Maybe. So the curse of knowledge, right, is something that I think a lot of experts run into, where you know so much about what you're talking about, right? You know so much about your field that you see, problems where there aren't problems, and you also have a struggle communicating that, right? This is related to what I was saying before about overspecification, and it was related to sort of the stuff I was saying before about impact, but it's also, I think, distinct as well from those. I think very frequently people get into these like sort of binds where they're like, oh, well, I don't know how I can say that I'm interested in energy transfer when I've only worked on, sort of like solar panels. And like those are actually different from, what I would want to work on at the graduate level for this and this reason. That's not a legible issue to a layperson. And I think a lot of people get stuck on the storytelling level by sort of specificities that won't be clear to their audience. And that's what I'm driving at when I'm saying the curse of knowledge, right? You know so much that you can see sort of like, oh, well, actually, this analogy that I'm trying to draw doesn't really work, or this connection isn't really what happened, right? We all kind of live our lives, backwards. That's something that I said at the another info session earlier this week, right? We kind of just stumble into things. We have a lot of reasons for doing anything, right? And because we know all those, it can kind of sometimes feel that the kinds of stories that you need to tell for fellowships are reduced somehow. But I think that is a failure, and I have some suggestions for how to overcome that. But I think you ought to be wary of listening to every objection that your mind throws up when you're trying to come up with these sort of stories. Um, so here's some ideas to kind of get you started. I'll cover a couple of these here. The first thing that I'll say is that what I was just saying about sort of narrative control connects to this point about taking advantage of retrospect, right? You can impose narrative control on your life that did not exist when you were living it, right? Most of you will have made a bunch of decisions in the moment based on things that were available to you at the time, things that sounded cool, opportunities that you just wanted to try out. But if you look back over your life, you'll be able to sort of identify threads that you really did not see going forward. And the art of this kind of storytelling is getting outside yourself and outside your lived experience a little bit and looking at what you've actually done and then telling a sort of like maximally charitable version of that history. Right? Telling a maximally charitable version of the experiences that you've had of your background, right? Treat yourself as if you were sort of more prescient than you were, as if you did see the whole picture the whole way, right? And that is how you can start to like put together the story that has a sort of unity to it, an integrity, a confluence to it, right? It might not feel true to what you thought at the time, but it is a reasonable interpretation of the decisions that you made. I think related to this is that it's just important to simplify. Like, I think most people, when they're first coming up with stories for their fellowship application, have sort of too many plates in the air, right? And are trying to do too much, tell the simplest story you can, right? Go back to that story structure. Think like, okay, well, what's the background? What experiences have I had that led me to what realization that led me to what future that I need to now have, right? The reality is that many epiphanies are sort of diffuse, spread across time, or broken up into many little epiphanies, right? But for the purposes of this kind of storytelling, you want to just condense and simplify and tell us about the one moment that made the difference as opposed to the 15 that together actually constituted the difference. That kind of selection, that kind of concision is important for making these stories work at the level of the application. Of course, when we're encouraging you to think through the stories for the first time, you don't want to commit yourself to that simplified story yet. You should feel free to try on different versions of the story, and you should feel free to tell that story in its full complexity. Much of the work that you'll do in the event of your selection for internal nomination is sort of this ideational brainstorming work. We'll ask you to write about your autobiography, to write about your whole life in its full complexity in an unrhetorical as possible way. And that work is not what's going to make it into the final application, but that kind of brainstorming hopefully will furnish you with enough data points that you can cherry pick the ones that tell the best story and create a simple narrative that will be compelling to the fellowship committees. And the last thing you can do, right, and the most actionable thing, and if Colleen is game to talk a little bit about the candidacy hackathons or designing your pitch workshops, they're a really great opportunity, and that I can't encourage you highly enough to attend.
Yeah, absolutely. So each year that we run this our internal nomination process, we always organize at least a handful of these designing your pitch workshops. If you know anyone that has applied for the Roads to Martell with us in the past, you may have heard about them talking about hackathons. And so it's the same thing, it's the same process, it's the same concept, but we kind of rebranded a little bit this year. What they are is essentially just a hour-long reflective workshop where you are engaging in a series of reflection questions, responding to them, that are designed to help you think about the different opportunities that you have taken advantage of, that different volunteer work that you've done, internships, the classes that you've had, and how all of these experiences, and especially experiences that you at first may not have thought were relevant to your candidacy, how all of those things are in fact relevant, and how they all kind of come together to help you, again, write this story, write this narrative, for your application process. So they're incredibly helpful. I will say, for any of the sophomores that are on the call, we are prioritizing our juniors, seniors, and young alumni for these events. And so if you have RSVP'd for them and you're a sophomore, you may get an email from us regarding that. But just kind of keeping that in mind. If we have the space and the opportunity to open those up, we will. We purposely keep them very small because they are interactive, and because once we sort of hit a threshold, the we start to see sort of like a diminish on the returns on your investment, right? And as well as our own. It's a very hands-on sort of workshop, in terms of the feedback that you're getting from us, as well as the feedback that you're getting from the other students. I think the designing your pitch workshops are a sort of great sort of mini example of how we as a center sort of run a lot of these processes, right? It's again, if you came or attended either of the two information workshops this week, you probably heard, or you did hear from Lauren, talking about that really important community aspect of it, of this development process, and the designing your pitch workshop is no different in that way, right? So you're turning to, and you're working with your peers that are attending that workshop, kind of walking through all of the different things that you're responding to, and the different examples of those different experiences, and how they all kind of fit together like little puzzle pieces. And it's through this workshop alone even that a lot of folks start to have these epiphany moments of how impactful something that previously they thought was just something that was part of their lived experience, but actually is very impactful to the work that they're interested in doing, the issue areas that they have identified, and their own personal and professional goals. So the designing your pitch workshops are very, very important and very, very helpful, as you are determining and creating your application materials, both for the internal nomination and the final application process.
Awesome. Yeah. And then the last thing you can do is and I encourage you all to, sign up for advising, and we're always happy to talk through some of the sort of story crafting stuff. I think it's one of the most rewarding and engaging parts of this application process. So that's the bulk of what we wanted to cover today. I guess I'll turn it over now. If you guys have any questions, we'll happily field those.
One thing I do want to highlight for folks, is our next our next workshop, as folks are kind of thinking about questions that they may have. Our next workshop related to the UK fellowships will be Monday, the 25th, from 3 to 4, on postgraduate study and research abroad. And so if you in particular have questions, right, about sort of like identifying appropriate graduate programs, what opportunities to kind of take on, both within Rhodes and Marshall and as well as other opportunities, like I think that's a great workshop to attend. So yeah, questions that anyone has about this process so far, or anything that we've talked about today? Isabella.
Hi, thanks again for this presentation. I'm curious if there's any reflection question or anything we can do starting now as we go through the process. Just something to get us thinking about our issue area outside of the workshops.
Yeah. That's a great question. I mean, I think some of the questions that we'll ask you on the autobiography form might be a good thing to start thinking about,
Mm-hmm.
I would, sort of do some story mining. Ask yourself, what were moments when I felt like I, became more myself, What were moments where I had a new interest develop, what's at least one good story from each of the experiences that I've had on my resume? You know, what is a moment where I realized, that way that I had been conceptualizing my field was different from the, reality of the facts on the ground, say. Right. And I would try and like story mine your background, think about, okay, everything that I did before college, everything that made me who I was, what are the key stories that happens there, for each of the experiences that I've listed on my, fellowships resume, what's one good story from each of those? Some of those will make it into the personal statement. Some of those will make it into the video introduction. Some of those will make it into just your understanding of the fellowship pitch. And those that don't make it in will probably make it into interviews, right? And then also list like sort of possible epiphanies. Like I said, the reality is that probably you can point to a number of moments where the way that you conceptualized your issue area changed. What are those possible moments? And then finally, right, think about that future component. Think about that fellowship component. Think about, well, what do I want to do in the future, right? How can I sort of narrate Isabella's future in a way that makes the most sense with the requirements of the fellowship application process? That I would use that structure as something to start hanging your ideation on. Hi, Bella.
Hi, I was wondering where all the presentation materials and for future info sessions, where the Zoom links will be.
Yes, they should be in the calendar invite. That was my error today, and I apologize for that. Also, you should get information about upcoming info sessions in the Monday email that goes out, and in other listserv updates. And the schedule is also on our webpage. So crf.georgetown.edu fellowships.
Okay, and should everything be on the website, or is there like a master list of anything, or I don't know. I think for some future ones, it was a little unclear to me how to RSVP or like where they're occurring.
Yeah, so all of our workshops will, I think with the exception of Wednesdays, will all be on Zoom. The RSVP form, I'll actually drop this in the chat for you all, but it is linked also on our website. So dropping that link, as you will come to find, is the RSVP link for all of the upcoming information sessions and workshops. If you all, there we go. And then this is our main Rhodes and Marshall page. And everything about the Rhodes and Marshall process will be on that page. So all of the application details, the nomination process, the upcoming workshops, and the Google form, like links to the Google forms to RSVP, past candidacy workshops from previous years. So, if any of you want to, watch any of those past workshops, you can find them there all the way at the bottom. They will also be linked under the webinars and workshop section of our website. You'll also find a link on there to, did I already say about advising? Yes. No. Advising requests. You can also make an advising request through the advising request form that's also linked there. The only thing that right now is not up are the links to the Google Forms to submit your application. Those will be up starting next week, or that will be up starting next week. And the Google form for your recommenders to submit their letters of recommendation. Folks who are on the call who applied last year will remember that we had all of your recommenders email us their letters. There are pros and cons to every format, right? But we're switching to a Google form this year, hopefully to make it easier on everyone to kind of collect those letters. So those are the two forms that right now are not up on the website, but they will be early next week.
Great.
Yeah, other questions from folks? Well, okay, yes. And one thing with the application materials, the cover sheet that you all will have to complete, which is where all of like really the most important thing, one I should say one of the most important things, that information and the updated directions for the video are on our website at the moment. So like you can still start like working on those materials. Excuse me, all of the resources to start creating your nomination application, all of that's on the website. It's just the forms to submit the materials are not up yet. So great. Any last minute or not any last lingering questions from anyone? Okay, well, Jonathan, any last remarks?
No, yeah, thank you so much for coming. And yeah, if you have any questions, please feel free to email us at fellowships@georgetown.edu or either of our personal emails. Great. All right. Thank you guys so much. And more from us soon. Okay.
Yes. All right.
Bye.
Talk to y'all. Bye.